Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to be looking at kind of a big topic,
Yeah.
money and power,
It's a big one.
how they've been intertwined really from 1700 all the way to the year 2000.
A lot to cover.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover,
Yeah.
but we've got some really fascinating source material to work with.
Oh, yeah.
Economic history texts, quotes from some pretty heavy hitters like Marx and Engels,
Oh, for sure.
and even a touch of opera.
No, that's interesting.
Might be surprised to learn that even Wagner has something to say about the forces that shape our world.
I'm intrigued already.
Have you ever felt like money rules everything?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're about to find out just how deep that rabbit hole goes.
Let's dive in.
So let's start with this idea of the cash nexus. It's a term coined by Thomas Carlyle,
Okay.
and he painted a pretty bleak picture, writing, "The bourgeoisie has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment."
So what do you think about that statement?
I mean, it's pretty dark.
It is.
But I think he's getting at something really important,
Yeah.
which is that as societies become increasingly market-driven,
Right.
the traditional bonds of community loyalty,
Mm-hmm.
even morality get eroded
Yeah.
and replaced by this kind of cold, calculating logic of money.
Right. Like everything becomes a transaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about how that might impact, your own life, your relationships, even your sense of belonging within a community.
Absolutely.
Is everything ultimately reduced to a transaction?
That's the question.
Yeah, and Marx and Engels, they echoed this sentiment in the Communist Manifesto.
Right.
And they argued that reducing human history to cash payment, the pursuit of cheap rations, was a shallow and ultimately unsatisfying explanation.
Yeah. They thought there were deeper forces at play.
Right.
Yeah.
And even art reflected this unease. Wagner's opera, The Ring, with its tale of Alberic and his obsession with gold, can be seen as an allegory for the relentless pursuit of wealth and power in the modern world.
And some scholars interpret Alberic's transformation into this ruthless industrialist who enslaves the Nibelungs for their labor
Right.
as a direct parallel to the dark side of capitalist accumulation.
Right. It's all about greed and exploitation.
Yeah. But it's important to remember that Marx's model for historical analysis, for all its complexity, is surprisingly simple at its core.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he believed that economic systems are the driving force behind historical change.
And that idea, whether you agree with it or not, has had a huge impact.
Oh, for sure.
Influencing generations of historians. Think of Emanuel Wallerstein's concept of the modern world system,
Yeah.
or Eric Hobsbawm's monumental 4-volume history of the world.
Hobsbawm was writing at the end of the 20th century when communism had seemingly collapsed and capitalism was declared the victor.
Yeah.
Yet he made a very provocative argument. He claimed that capitalism was actually rescued from collapsing in the 1930s and 40s by the Soviet Union.
Now, that's a bold claim.
It is, he argued, that the economic and military strength of the Soviet Union forced capitalism to adapt and reform, essentially saving it from its own internal contradictions.
So for Hobsbawm, the Soviet Union's collapse didn't invalidate Marx's critiques of capitalism. It just delayed the inevitable reckoning.
Exactly. He saw it as a temporary setback.
And he went even further, predicting a return to state control due to the environmental and economic pressures created by capitalism's unlimited pursuit of profit.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is the reasoning behind his prediction.
Yeah, what was it?
He argued that the very logic of capitalism, with its focus on endless growth and profit maximization,
Right.
would ultimately lead to unsustainable levels of environmental degradation and social inequality.
So you're saying like climate change, resource depletion, pollution.
Exactly.
All of that could be seen as the unintended consequences of a system that prioritizes profit above all else.
I think that's a really powerful argument.
It is food for thought, for sure.
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
So now let's turn to a seemingly counterintuitive idea,
Okay.
the role of war in shaping the state.
War.
War.
How can something so destructive lead to the creation of institutions?
Right. It seems paradoxical. But to wage war, you need money,
A lot of it.
and lots of it. So governments are forced to come up with ways to raise that money.
They have to fund the war effort somehow.
Exactly. And military spending has historically been a major driver of innovation in revenue raising,
Interesting.
leading to the development of various taxes, from property taxes to income taxes.
The story of taxation is fascinating, full of twists, turns, and even rebellions.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
And the cost of military hardware alone has skyrocketed over time.
Oh, for sure.
Compare the cost of a bomber from World War II to a modern fighter jet.
Yeah.
It's a staggering difference.
It is. Do you think that ever-increasing cost is sustainable in the long run?
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly putting a strain on government budgets around the world,
Yeah.
and it's directly tied to the increasing destructiveness of weapons.
Which is reflected in the dramatic rise in war fatalities from the 18th to the 20th century.
Right. World War II in particular saw the deliberate targeting of civilians on a scale never before witnessed.
It's a sobering thought.
It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of conflict.
It is.
So let's trace the evolution of taxation itself.
Okay.
It's a story that stretches all the way back to medieval times,
Wow.
with this constant shifting balance between direct and indirect taxes.
So early on, governments relied heavily on indirect taxes, things like tariffs and excise duties.
Okay.
These were easier to collect,
Right.
but often placed a disproportionate burden on the poor.
And people weren't afraid to fight back.
Oh, no.
Think about the riots in Palermo and Naples in 1647, sparked by a new excise tax.
People literally took to the streets in protest.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
It's a reminder that taxation is never simply a technical matter.
Right.
It's deeply intertwined with social and political power.
Absolutely.
And then came the rise of income tax, initially intended as a way to tax the wealthy.
Right.
But world wars, rising incomes, and inflation meant that income tax increasingly impacted the working class as well.
Makes sense.
The UK system of income tax schedules goes all the way back to 1803,
Wow.
with different categories for every imaginable source of income.
It's a testament to the enduring power of bureaucracy.
It really is. Once a system is in place, it tends to persist, becoming more complex over time.
That's for sure.
But let's shift our focus for a moment and consider how control of finances directly translates into power.
Okay, I like it.
Take the English crown, for example.
Right.
The English crown's lack of independent financial means actually played a key role in the growth of parliamentary power.
Interesting.
They had to go to Parliament for funding,
Right.
which gave Parliament leverage.
So it's a case of financial dependence leading to a shift in power.
Exactly. In contrast, the French nobility's fierce resistance to taxation contributed to the instability of the French monarchy.
They clung to their privileges.
They clung to their privileges, ultimately at their own peril.
Wow, that's a cautionary tale.
It's fascinating how these financial struggles shape the course of history.
It is.
Speaking of historical figures, did you know that the poet Robert Burns, the one who wrote Auld Lang Syne,
Yeah.
had to renounce his revolutionary sympathies to keep his government job at the Scottish Board of Excise?
Really?
It's a stark reminder that economic realities can sometimes force people to compromise their ideals.
A clash between principles and pragmatism, for sure.
Exactly. But let's move on to a truly transformative development, the rise of the welfare state.
Okay.
The welfare state represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between money and power,
How so?
with the government's primary role becoming redistribution, not just defense.
It's a recognition that the state has a responsibility to provide for the well-being of its citizens.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that it didn't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
The welfare state emerged from a long history of earlier, less successful attempts to provide Social Security, finally gaining widespread acceptance in the 20th century.
And there were different approaches, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
authoritarian regimes like Nazi Germany, for example, focused on job creation and infrastructure as their form of welfare.
Right. It's a reminder that the welfare state has taken many forms,
Yeah,
reflecting different political ideologies and social priorities.
for sure.
But all of these social programs require funding,
Right.
which brings us to the burden of public debt.
Okay.
Governments have always borrowed money to finance wars and other expenditures,
Yeah.
leading to the accumulation of massive national debts.
So what are the implications of passing on this debt to future generations?
Right. Is it fair to saddle them with the bill for spending they didn't benefit from?
That's a tough question.
It raises questions about intergenerational fairness and the long-term sustainability of our economic model.
One way to think about this is through the concept of the government's intertemporal budget constraint. Put simply, it means that today's debt will eventually have to be paid by future generations through taxes.
So are we essentially kicking the can down the road?
That's a concern many economists have.
Yeah.
There are studies that show many developed countries would need to increase taxes significantly just to achieve generational balance,
Mean.
meaning that each generation pays for its own consumption.
Okay.
The potential for intergenerational conflict is certainly there,
Yeah.
as future generations might feel burdened by having to pay for the spending of previous generations.
It's like that age-old question, are we leaving a better world for our children or just a bigger bill?
A question that every generation has to grapple with.
It is, but before we spiral into existential dread,
Yeah.
let's remember that governments have a few tricks up their sleeves when it comes to managing debt.
Okay, like what?
One of those tricks is inflation.
Inflation usually seen as a bad thing, but it can also be used to reduce the real value of debt.
How does that work?
When the prices of goods and services rise, the value of money decreases. This means that the real value of a debt, the amount of purchasing power it represents, goes down.
Okay.
So if a government has a lot of debt and inflation is high, the real burden of that debt is reduced.
So in a way, inflation can act like a stealthy debt reduction strategy.
Yeah, you could say that.
But what are the consequences of this for everyday people?
Well, inflation can erode the purchasing power of consumers, making it more expensive to buy goods and services.
Right, so it's a balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah.
Governments are trying to reduce their debt burden
Right.
without causing excessive economic hardship for their citizens.
It's a tough challenge.
It seems like there are no easy answers.
That's the challenge of economic policy making.
Yeah.
There are always trade-offs, and the best course of action is often unclear.
But let's not lose sight of the fact that behind all of this economic jargon are real people whose lives are affected by these decisions.
That's an important point.
It's important to remember that economics is not just about numbers and theories. It's about people's livelihoods, their hopes and dreams, their struggles and triumphs.
Absolutely.
It's about the choices we make as a society and the consequences those choices have on our lives and the lives of future generations.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations,
Yeah,
to engage in informed debate and to challenge assumptions.
absolutely. The relationship between money and power is complex and multifaceted,
Is.
and there are no easy answers.
That's for sure. Speaking of consequences, let's shift our focus to a force that's reshaping the world as we speak. Globalization. It's a phenomenon that has influenced both economics and politics for centuries, and we're seeing some fascinating parallels between the world before 1914 and the present day.
It feels like history is repeating itself, doesn't it?
Huh.
But how exactly does today's globalization compare to what was happening a century ago?
Well, by some measures, globalization is even more pronounced today. The sheer volume of trade as a percentage of global GDP is significantly higher now than it was back then.
So more goods are crisscrossing the globe than ever before. That's pretty mind-boggling.
Absolutely, and it's not just physical goods. The amount of capital flowing around the world for investments and other financial transactions has also exploded. Foreign assets as a percentage of global GDP are way higher today than they were in 1913.
That's incredible. It really highlights how interconnected the world has become. But this level of interconnectedness, it must come with its own set of risks, right? What happens when one part of the system starts to crumble?
You're hitting on a crucial point. Globalization does have its downsides, and one of the biggest risks is the potential for financial crises. Look at what happened in the late 1920s when the global financial system essentially collapsed. It triggered a worldwide depression with devastating consequences.
It's a sobering reminder that a crisis in one corner of the world can quickly spread like wildfire, impacting everyone. But surely we've learned from those past mistakes. Our financial systems must be more resilient now, right?
We've certainly made efforts to learn from the past, implementing strict financial regulations and fostering international cooperation. But let's be honest, the global financial system is incredibly complex. There's always the potential for unexpected shocks and unintended consequences. Think about the 2008 financial crisis, for example.
That was a pretty close call, wasn't it?
It certainly shook the global economy. So while we've made progress, we can't afford to become complacent. We need to constantly adapt our policies and institutions to mitigate these risks.
It sounds like a constant game of cat and mouse between trying to reap the benefits of globalization while also trying to protect ourselves from its potential downsides. But here's a point I find really interesting. There's evidence suggesting that financial crises during the gold standard era were actually shorter than the ones we've seen in the modern world of floating exchange rates.
That's a fascinating observation. Advocates of the gold standard argue that because countries were committed to maintaining a fixed exchange rate with gold, there was a greater degree of predictability and discipline in the system. When a crisis did occur, the path back to stability was clear. restore the pre-crisis exchange rate with gold.
So the fixed exchange rate acted as a kind of anchor, preventing things from spiraling out of control for too long. But didn't the gold standard also have its own set of problems?
Certainly. Critics point out that maintaining a fixed exchange rate could be incredibly painful, often forcing countries to adopt austerity measures that deepened recessions and caused social unrest. There was less flexibility to respond to economic shocks.
It seems like every system has its own set of trade-offs, stability versus flexibility. It's a dilemma that policymakers have been grappling with for centuries. But what does all this mean for the future of globalization? Are we headed towards a more interconnected world? Or are we witnessing a retreat into nationalism and protectionism? What do you think?
It's a question that's being fiercely debated right now. There are signs of a backlash against globalization, fueled by anxieties about job losses, inequality, and the erosion of cultural identity. On the other hand, you have powerful forces pushing for even greater integration, driven by technology, multinational corporations, and the growing realization that global challenges require global solutions. Think about climate change, for example.
It's hard to imagine tackling a problem like climate change without some level of global cooperation, isn't it?
Exactly. So it's a real tug of war between these opposing forces. The future of globalization is being shaped right now, and it's up to us as informed and engaged citizens to decide what kind of world we want to build.
It's a big responsibility, but also an incredible opportunity. We're living in a time of profound change, and we have the power to shape the course of history. But we need to be informed, engaged, and willing to think critically about these complex issues. Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about economic systems, but what about the role of democracy? Can democracy effectively harness the power of money for the common good, or will it ultimately be corrupted by wealth and inequality?
It's a fundamental question. Francis Fukuyama famously argued that history is moving towards a kind of end of history, with liberal democracy as the final and best form of government, the one best suited to promoting both economic growth and individual freedom.
It's an optimistic view, but there are also those who are more skeptical, right?
Absolutely. We've seen the rise of powerful challenges to the democratic model in recent years. Think about the resurgence of populism, the spread of disinformation and propaganda, and the growing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. These trends raise serious concerns about the future of democracy.
It's certainly enough to make even the most ardent Democrat a little uneasy. So how do we reconcile this tension between the promise of democracy and the very real challenges it's facing? How do we ensure that the power of money is used to serve the many, not just the few?
That's the great dilemma of our time, and it's a question that each generation has to grapple with. There are no easy answers. But by engaging in open and informed debate, by holding our leaders accountable, and by demanding a system that prioritizes fairness and opportunity for all, we can at least strive to create a future where money and power are used to build a more just and prosperous world.
That's a powerful call to action. But let's dig a little deeper into the arguments for and against democracy. Mancur Olson, for example, argued that democracy is actually good for the economy. He claimed that democratically elected governments are more incentivized to maximize economic output because they want to get reelected. They have a vested interest in keeping their constituents happy and prosperous.
It's an interesting argument, but it's important to remember that democracy is more than just an economic system. It's a set of values, principles, and institutions designed to protect individual rights, promote the rule of law, and ensure that power is distributed fairly.
So while economic growth is important, it's not the only measure of a successful democracy. We need to consider things like social justice, equality, and the protection of individual liberties. It's about finding that delicate balance between prosperity and fairness, between individual freedom and collective responsibility. What do you think is the key to striking that balance?
It's a balancing act that's constantly evolving. Democracy is not a static endpoint. It's a dynamic process that requires vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to confront difficult questions. It's about recognizing that there are different perspectives and values at play and finding ways to accommodate those differences while still upholding core democratic principles.
It sounds like democracy is less about finding the right answers and more about creating a system where we can have these debates and make these decisions collectively, even if we don't always agree.
Exactly. Democracy is a messy, imperfect process, but it's also the best system we have for ensuring that power is ultimately accountable to the people. but it requires active participation, informed engagement, and a willingness to defend democratic values.
And it also requires us to be aware of the potential pitfalls, right? History is full of examples of democracies backsliding, of leaders succumbing to corruption, and of the wealthy and powerful rigging the system in their favor. So how do we safeguard democracy from its own internal flaws?
It's a constant struggle. There's no magic bullet, but there are things we can do to strengthen democratic institutions and norms. Transparency and accountability are essential.
Shining a light on how decisions are made and who benefits. It's about making sure that power isn't operating in the shadows.
Precisely. We also need to protect freedom of the press and ensure that citizens have access to reliable information. An informed citizenry is essential for holding power to account.
But what about the influence of money in politics? It seems like every election cycle we hear concerns about wealthy donors having undue influence over elected officials. How do we address that?
The concentration of wealth and power can pose a real threat to democratic values. One approach is campaign finance reform, limiting the amount of money individuals and corporations can contribute to political campaigns.
So leveling the playing field and reducing the influence of big money.
Right. Another approach is to increase public financing of elections so that candidates are less reliant on private donations. This could help reduce the perception that politicians are beholden to special interests.
It's all about finding ways to ensure that political power is derived from the will of the people, not the size of someone's bank account. But money isn't the only threat to democracy. We've also seen the rise of disinformation and propaganda, especially in the age of social media. It seems like it's getting harder and harder to distinguish truth from falsehood.
It's a serious problem. Disinformation can erode trust in democratic institutions, polarize public opinion, and make it difficult to have meaningful debates about important issues.
It's like a poison that seeps into the very fabric of society, making it harder to have rational conversations and find common ground.
One way to combat this is to promote media literacy and critical thinking skills. We need to equip people with the tools to evaluate information and discern fact from fiction.
So teaching people how to be savvy consumers of information, to think critically about what they're seeing and reading online.
Exactly. And we need to hold social media platforms accountable for the spread of disinformation. They have a responsibility to prevent their platforms from being used to manipulate public opinion and undermine democratic processes.
But there's a fine line, isn't there, between combating disinformation and protecting freedom of speech. We don't want to create a system where governments have too much control over what people can say and think.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, and we need to be careful not to sacrifice fundamental freedoms in the name of combating disinformation. But we also can't ignore the very real threat it poses to democracy. It's a challenge that will require careful consideration and ongoing dialogue.
It seems like every solution comes with its own set of challenges. It's like we're constantly trying to find the right balance to navigate between competing values and priorities, but that's the nature of democracy, isn't it? It's a messy, evolving process, and there are no easy answers. Speaking of messy and evolving, let's revisit a point made by Alexis de Tocqueville back in the 19th century. He was fascinated by American democracy, but he also worried about its potential to descend into a tyranny of the majority.
It's a classic critique of democracy, the idea that the majority can trample on the rights of the minority. Tocqueville believed that in a democracy, the pursuit of equality could actually lead to a loss of individual liberty, as the masses might empower a tyrannical state in the name of the common good.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very values that make democracy appealing, things like equality and majority rule, could also be its undoing. So how do we guard against this potential for democratic despotism? How do we ensure that democracy protects the rights of all citizens, not just the majority?
It's about building institutions and norms that safeguard individual rights, even when they clash with the will of the majority. Things like an independent judiciary, a free press, and a strong civil society are crucial. They act as checks on the power of the state and ensure that the rights of all citizens are protected, regardless of their political beliefs or social status.
So not enough to simply have majority rule, we need to have safeguards in place to protect the rights of those who might find themselves in the minority. It's about recognizing that democracy is about more than just winning elections. It's about creating a society where everyone feels valued and respected, even when they disagree. But let's just shift gears for a moment and talk about a topic that's often seen as dry and technical, but is actually incredibly relevant to our lives: public debt.
Public debt is a topic that has been debated for centuries and is especially relevant today as many countries around the world grapple with soaring debt levels.
It seems like every time I turn on the news, I hear about another country teetering on the brink of a debt crisis. So what's the big deal about public debt? Why should we be concerned about it?
There are several reasons why public debt can be problematic. Firstly, it can crowd out private investment. When governments borrow money, it can drive up interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses to invest and grow. This can have a negative impact on economic growth and job creation.
So it's like the government is competing with businesses for loans, and businesses are losing out.
In a way, yes.
Right.
Secondly, high levels of public debt can lead to higher taxes in the future.
Because eventually, someone has to pay back all that borrowed money, right?
Exactly. And that burden often falls on future generations who may have to pay higher taxes to service the debt accumulated by previous generations.
So are we essentially passing the buck to our kids and grandkids?
In essence, yes. And this raises questions about intergenerational fairness and the sustainability of our current fiscal policies.
It's a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? To think that our generation might be enjoying benefits today that will ultimately be paid for by our children and grandchildren.
It's a moral dilemma that we need to confront. But it's not just about future generations. High levels of public debt can make a country more vulnerable to economic shocks. If there is a sudden economic downturn or financial crisis, a heavily indebted country is in a weaker position to respond. They may have less fiscal flexibility to stimulate the economy or provide social safety nets.
So it's like being caught in a financial straitjacket. You have less room to maneuver when a crisis hits. But aren't there ways for governments to manage their debt? What about inflation? We talked about it earlier in the context of reducing the real value of debt.
That's right. Inflation can be a tool for reducing the debt burden, but it's a double-edged sword. When the prices of goods and services rise, the value of money decreases. This means that the real value of a debt, the amount of purchasing power it represents, goes down. So if a government has a lot of debt and inflation is high, the real burden of that debt is reduced.
It's like a sneaky way of getting out of paying what you owe.
Yeah.
But doesn't inflation also hurt everyone else in the economy? I mean, it makes everything more expensive, doesn't it?
It can, especially if it's high and volatile. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of consumers, making it harder to make ends meet. It can also create uncertainty and discourage investment. Businesses are less certain about future costs and profits, making them hesitant to invest and expand.
So there's a real trade-off there. Reducing the debt burden through inflation might come at the cost of economic stability and consumer confidence.
Exactly. And that's why managing public debt and inflation is such a delicate balancing act. Governments need to find ways to keep debt levels sustainable without undermining economic growth or causing undue hardship for citizens.
It sounds like a real juggling act. But this raises another question for me. What role does globalization play in all of this? Does it make managing debt and inflation easier or harder for governments?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll explore in more detail in the final part of our deep dive. Picking up where we left off, how does globalization affect a country's ability to manage its finances?
Yeah, a lot of moving pieces there.
It is, and one fascinating aspect is the effect on interest rates.
Okay.
In the era of globalization before World War I,
Mhm.
there was a striking convergence of interest rates across the globe.
Really?
Think about it. Countries as different as Britain, France, Germany, Argentina, Australia,
Wow.
all saw their long-term interest rates moving in sync.
So money was basically hopping borders, chasing the highest returns, and this brought interest rates closer together.
Exactly. It's a textbook example of market integration.
Okay.
Investors had more options, more places to park their money.
Right.
So countries were competing for capital by offering attractive interest rates. This convergence was a clear signal of just how interconnected the global financial system had become.
It's wild to think that decisions made in London could ripple out and affect the cost of borrowing in a place like Argentina.
It's true.
But this interconnectedness, as cool as it is, also has a dangerous side, right? What happens when things go south in one part of the system?
That's the Achilles heel of globalization contagion.
Okay.
When a crisis erupts in one country, it can quickly spread to others. Think of it like a financial virus.
Oh, yeah.
We saw this play out dramatically in the late 1920s when the collapse of Austria's Creditanstalt Bank
Oh, yeah.
triggered a domino effect, bringing down banks and financial institutions across Europe and even the United States.
So globalization can make us vulnerable to these system-wide shocks.
It can, but it wasn't all doom and gloom.
Okay, were there any countries that managed to ride the wave of globalization and come out stronger?
Absolutely. Britain's rise to become the dominant financial power in the 19th century is a prime example.
Okay.
They had a stable political system,
Oh.
a sophisticated financial sector,
Okay.
and a commitment to free trade that made London the epicenter of global finance.
So they were like the financial superpower of their time.
You could say that. What kind of impact did that have on the world?
Yeah, I mean, what did that actually look like?
Their influence was enormous.
Really?
They financed railroads in the Americas, mines in Africa, infrastructure projects all over the globe.
Wow.
Their currency, the pound sterling, became the world's reserve currency, the one everyone wanted to hold.
It's amazing how a single country could wield that much financial power.
It is. But as we know, no empire lasts forever.
Right. What happened to Britain's dominance?
Like all empires, they eventually faced challenges.
Mm-hmm.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, rising industrial powers like Germany and the United States
Okay.
began to chip away at their dominance.
Right.
World War I dealt a heavy blow to their economy and their financial standing.
So their power started to decline.
It did. By the mid-20th century, the U.S. had taken over as the new global superpower, both economically and militarily.
It's a classic story of shifting power dynamics.
It is.
A reminder that even the mightiest nations are not immune to change.
Yeah.
But let's bring this back to the present.
Okay.
Where do we stand with globalization today? Are we moving towards a more interconnected world? Or are we seeing retreat, a rise in nationalism and protectionism?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And it's a source of intense debate.
Yeah.
There are definitely signs of a backlash against globalization.
Yeah.
People are worried about job losses, rising inequality, and the loss of cultural identity.
Right. But there are also these powerful forces pushing for greater integration.
There are, driven by technological advancements, the growth of multinational corporations, and the realization that many of the challenges we face, climate change, pandemics, demand global solutions.
So it's kind of this tug of war between these opposing forces.
It is.
And the outcome is still up in the air.
Yeah, we're at a crossroads.
The future of globalization is being shaped as we speak.
It is.
And it's up to us as informed and engaged citizens to decide what kind of world we want to live in.
Right. Do we embrace a more interconnected world with all its complexities and challenges?
Yeah.
Or do we retreat into ourselves and risk missing out on the potential benefits of collaboration and cooperation?
It's a choice with huge consequences.
It is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the cash nexus to the rise of the welfare state, from the evolution of taxation to the dilemmas of globalization.
It's been a journey.
It really has. And we've seen how money and power have been intertwined throughout history, shaping the world we live in today.
And how these forces have driven both progress and conflict, creating both opportunities and challenges.
But most importantly, we've seen how these forces impact our lives, our communities, and our future.
Absolutely.
And that's really what this deep dive has been about, empowering ourselves with knowledge and understanding so we can be active participants in shaping the world we want to see.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Okay, shoot.
Given all that we've discussed, what do you think the future holds? Is more globalization inevitable?
Good question.
Will democracy prevail? Is a new era of financial upheaval just around the corner?
Lots to think about.
We encourage you to continue exploring these topics, to dig deeper into the sources we've mentioned, and to engage in conversations with others. The story of money and power is still being written, and your voice, your perspective matters.
Well said.
And remember, even amidst these complex and often daunting challenges, there's always room for a little bit of humor. Like our friend Robert Burns, the poet, who had to renounce his revolutionary ideals to keep his government shot, once wrote, "Freedom and whiskey gang together."
A reminder that even those grappling with power and finances understand the simple pleasures in life.
Exactly. Until our next deep dive, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring.